and who is fighting a hard fight on behalf of the people. Please welcome Mayor Ras Baraka.
So it's a pleasure to be here in Harlem. I like that saying, Jarvis, because I'm in a pit of crocodiles. So we need some people to help me walk over together. I'm going to call you, man, you know, hold you to that. But it's incredible to see all of the folks that come up here. I hope I have something left to say after everybody talk. They did such an excellent job saying everything I thought that needed to be said, that was right on point. The young people in their efforts and their excitement and their passion. I appreciate the work and the tribute as well. We love you over in Newark, New Jersey. We want to do some of the same kinds of things with our young people over there, and I appreciate you. Trust me, we need more of you out in these streets like this today, and we should embrace the work that they're doing and push it forward. Absolutely. It's always a pleasure to be in the nation's black capital. In Harlem, you know, my father made me aware of that. Trying to hold on, huh? That's all right. History will make it clear. That's for sure. So I thank you for inviting me during this Black History Month. I just spoke earlier in Newark at Beth Israel Hospital to the afternoon crowd, and I get to end my evening here in Harlem. And I think there's a lot to be said with all of these groups that are coming up. We need to find an opportunity to bring us all together in some kind of collective and some kind of cohesive united front that'll help us push forward despite all of our different ideologies and ideas. We need to build some kind of united front. And so I think that the history of our struggle in this country really is a basis for that united front. And I'm going to attempt to move us through that to make the point that we will not go back, that we can't go back. Above our national tumultuous joy, I hear the mournful wail of millions whose chains, heavy and grievous yesterday, are today rendered more intolerable by the jubilee shouts that reached them. If I do forget, if I do not faithfully remember those bleeding of sorrow this day, may my right hand forget her cunning and my tongue cleave to the roof of my mouth. To forget them, to pass lightly over their wrongs and chime in with this popular theme would be treason most scandalous and shocking, and would make me a reproach before God and the world. That's Fred Douglass, what to the slave is the 4th of July. I was recently watching one of the Sunday morning news shows and listened to the host and a few of his guests discuss Syria, Iraq, and Libya and ISIL all in the same breath. In that discussion, one of the guests announced with extreme certainty that the problem is that America ended the tyranny there but did not help set up the government, and that the real issue was that these countries have never experienced democracy before, and to allow them to experiment at it was a horrific error. I wanted to remind him that democracy is a relatively new concept in the world, and that monarchies, fiefdoms, oligarchies have had a long and painful presence on this planet. That in fact, while the colonists here in 1776 were declaring that all men were created equal and have been endowed with certain rights by their creator, they denied those very rights to what became millions of Africans that have been made into African Americans by a cruel act of history, a deliberate depopulation of an entire continent, and a consistent and premeditated effort to organize every sector of society to erase their history, strip them of their humanity, and relegate them to chattel. Commodities to be bought and sold on a free market whose laws work to systemically reinforce the idea that they were property and less than human, whose social order was designed to make them drown in servitude and despise their own reflection. In the middle of their bombast, as Douglass referred to it, mostly all of the U.S. presidents before the Civil War actually owned slaves, beginning with George Washington from the Jeffersonian home to the swamplands of D.C., and one of the most recognized symbols around the world for freedom, the White House was built with the intolerable cruelty of slavery. And today we are still fighting for our humanity. Like Malcolm said, to be recognized as human beings and to be treated as human beings. We have always been the chink in America's armor. Its dark secret, both figuratively and literally. Our presence reminds them of their schizophrenic relationship with equality, both social and economic. Our political thrust has been our attempts to first protect ourselves and then to begin the long march toward democracy and then ultimately true equality. We have been the longest and most consistent force for democracy in this country. Even as slaves, we pushed against a planter system that created huge amounts of wealth from human flesh, from Sinclair and Tubman and Truth and Douglas and Vesey to every soldier that fought in the segregated Union Army to see the system of slavery brought to its knees. On New Year's Day in 1863, abolitionists lined up in the nation's capital. Among them was Frederick Douglass, who wore the memories of slavery on his back like a permanent overcoat, all waiting to hear that then President Lincoln deliver the news of the Emancipation Proclamation. They didn't wait there because they believed Lincoln was a radical abolitionist, or even as popular media would call him, a vampire slayer. They stood there because they had been fighting and pushing for years against a formidable institution of slavery, and before that day, there was no words and no action from a government that allowed millions to be brought and sold and murdered under the cloak of freedom. Some thought he wouldn't sign it, but he did. Their work, their struggle was not in vain. And when you imagine that also present that day were escaped slaves from Virginia, waiting to hear that chattel slavery was moving closer to its permanent end, you could see the real relevance of this act and how in this context, it was even radical at that time. There's some people who say that the Emancipation Proclamation was not radical, but it was radical to those ex-slaves from Virginia. It was radical to those people who ran away from slavery in Virginia that made their way to the nation's capital to hear that freedom was coming and that freedom was near. And while we sit in the luxury of today, we get to criticize a document in 1863 that pushed America closer to democracy. This is instructive to us because we have to see that our long and steady push for democracy has a logical end. An end in social democracy, a political democracy, and economic democracy. America's short history on this planet is forever stained with our presence and our push for equality. No matter how much they try to hide it or make you feel un-American for raising its contradictions, like they did to Robeson or Du Bois and King. And if you listen to the senile and racist rants of Giuliani, even Obama has been included in that. We have to understand that the logical end of struggle is freedom, like the logical end of racism is slavery and fascism. That our collective efforts have paid off and will pay off, but more importantly, we have to stay in the fight. We have to stay in the fight. Those that crowded the streets that New Year's Day looked at this document as the bottom, not the top, as a start, not a finish. The same way we have to look at the election of the first black president 2 times in a row by a broad coalition of progressives. We have to look at that as the bottom, not the top. It's the start, not the finish. Some of us forget that the election of Obama was the beginning of a movement, and it's not the culmination of a movement. We didn't elect Fred Douglass. We didn't elect William Lloyd Garrison. We didn't elect Malcolm X or even Dr. King. But millions and millions of Americans whose lives were littered with Jim Crow, who witnessed their neighbors brutalized and their churches bombed, whose families were terrorized by fear and held down by brute force and a lingering poverty and desperate inequality, rejoiced that day that they were moving closer and closer again to more democracy, like those that rejoiced in the face of partial freedom could not have imagined that a few years later that over 2,000 blacks would be elected to office during Reconstruction. That in Mississippi, which was one of the country's most violent and violently racist states, had its first black senator, Hiram Revels, who assumed the seat of a senator who was removed because of the state's rebellion to the Union. He was met with resistance because the Southern senators argued that Dred Scott defined us as property and he could not serve in the legislature because he was somebody's property. But they lost that fight because of the Civil War and Reconstruction amendments. This was a short-lived progressive period that was set back and erased from history after the 1877 Compromise, which pulled the troops out of the South that held back the backlash of slavery and white supremacy. A deal was made, you know, like the deals they make today. A deal was made for the presidency of the United States in return for the removal of troops. This returned power to the Klan and the slave codes that gave birth to Jim Crow and the laws even in Germany to persecute Jews and apartheid in South Africa to uphold tyranny. We fought here in the ugly face of the most abhorrent and arbitrary violence in America. And what did we fight for? Reverend George Lee was shot in the face and killed for urging blacks to vote, not for being revolutionary, but to vote. Lamar Smith shot down on a courthouse lawn in Brookhaven, Mississippi, trying to vote, not overthrow the government, just vote. Herbert Lee was shot and killed by a member of the Mississippi legislature because he wanted to vote. He didn't want to vote in another country, he wanted to vote in America. He didn't want to vote somewhere else, he wanted to vote here. He wasn't trying to fight to be a citizen somewhere else, he died trying to be a citizen of America. And we all know of Medgar Evers, whose blood fell in the lap of his wife as he died in her arms on his porch, murdered for organizing. We were allowed to see the bloody streets of Selma on the big screen and our children's heads crushed under the boulders of hatred and subjugation. Our mothers beaten in the streets and our lives in the hands of segregationists. And as we reminisce about how terrible it is, we don't have to look far to see that the court's highest place ruled in Shelby County, Alabama versus Holder, that the Voting Rights Act should be destroyed, that the provisions that it upheld should be torn apart, that those districts that had some of the worst history of disenfranchisement in this country and forced them to prove that anything they put in place would not act as an obstacle to the right to vote. Ironically, before this was done, that law blocked some 1,000 attempts to turn over the right to vote. But they did it anyway. And after that, 7 of the states that were identified in this law began to enact changes to their state's voter laws. Texas enacted one of the country's most stringent voter ID laws. Virginia purged 38,000 voters, and Kansas suspended some 18,000 voters. And as the laws become more and more restrictive, they disproportionately affected poor, black, brown, and immigrant communities. We also don't have to look very far to see that our struggle for humanity is still relevant. We don't have to refer to Emmett Till thrown at the bottom of the Tallahatchie River, or Jackson murdered by the police in Selma, or countless freedom fighters killed and trumped up on charges in the 60s. We can go to Mike Brown in Ferguson, or Eric Garner choked to death on the pavement, or Tamir Rice forcing our children still in 2015 to say that their lives matter. They are in fact human beings and not commodities to be shipped around the world as entertainment through mainstream media, or left to die on dirty sidewalks, criminalized and demonized as a precursor for public subjugation and ultimately slaughter. Our condition today in some instances are worse than they have ever been, even in the face of the first black president. Some people think that that's a contradiction, but the Klan showed up after slavery, not during slavery. We have to be smart enough to fight against the enemies of this president and fight to push democracy to its limits at the same time. Today, there are more black men in prison than there were slaves in 1860. More than were incarcerated in South Africa at the heart of apartheid. Our unemployment rate has been twice that of the national average for the last 50 years. And for African American and Latino young men, the numbers grow into almost 50%. With the recent attacks on the public sector unions and jobs, the country is losing hundreds and thousands of public sector jobs, which are responsible for hiring more black and brown people with living wage jobs than any other sector in this society. 40% of all of our children grow up in a crippling and devastating poverty, many in single-headed households that make below living wages. Almost daily in America, a black person is killed by some police agency, and the leading cause of death for young black men is homicide. An overwhelming proportion of our children will receive some form of government assistance in their lifetime, and the wealth gap has tripled since 1989. 1 in every 4 of every African-American households are food insecure. That means they can barely feed their families. At the end of King's life, he talked vehemently about the 2 Americas. One America that is basking in the sunlight of opportunity, and the other weighted down by the fatigue of despair, finding themselves prisoners in the promised land. 2 Americas, 1 rich and 1 poor. 1 filled not just with black Americans, but also with poor whites and Chicanos and Latinos and natives. But if you look hard enough, you would see disproportionately that the huge population of them represent the African American community. He spoke of how he traveled north and found himself being booed by young men who waited for King's promise that America would soften his heart and that the conditions that plagued them would be lifted after decades of protest and negotiation, only to find out that the same people that stood with him in Alabama distanced themselves from him in Chicago, that they were willing to stand against the outright barbarism of Bull Connor and the public violence that colored the TVs across the nation, but could not find that same courage to provide decent housing or fight for living wages. That they were there to speak against segregations in stores, but not willing to fight so that we could afford to eat out of those same stores. And so here we are today in an unfinished march toward democracy. We have gained civil rights and have been pushing, but because we have not continued our march forward, held down by sectarian ideas and apart by a dull analysis that keeps us away from the masses of our people, we have become educated fools that have become brilliant at identifying the ills of society, but unlearned in a methodology of how to push that society forward. So we're being pushed backward, like my father would say, like the Greek story of Sisyphus, plagued to roll a rock up a hill only to have it pushed back down on his head over and over again. As we watch the courts eviscerate voting rights, they are presently, as we sit here tonight, working to dismantle the Fair Housing Act that protected millions against discrimination in housing. And as the wealth in this country is consistently being concentrated in the hands of a few, the Supreme Court, the same court that disenfranchised millions, gave the wealthiest Americans the right to spend untold amounts of money in elections and influence the political landscape. And while our communities are not being bailed out, banks were giving billions of dollars of the people's money. And after they stole the wealth from working people and robbed almost 50% of black America's wealth alone. We are living in an era of the most radical form of capitalism, where the goal is to make obscene amounts of money at the people's expense, to develop schemes to rob pensions and Social Security, to take over the public sector like public education and loot the coffers there. We have to push back. We have to see that our struggle for freedom and democracy is tied into every immigrant trying to earn a living, to every worker fighting for higher wages, to fight for equal access to the ballot box, for public education, affordable housing, and access to health care for all Americans. For example, if we just raised the minimum wage, if we just raised the minimum wage, Congress doesn't want the president to raise it to even $10, that they would shut down the entire government before they gave you $10. They don't even want the president to expand health care to all Americans, that they would overturn the government not for taxation without representation, but so poor people can have access to health care. If we even just raised it to $10, but I suggest, like it was said earlier, $15, we would pull millions of people out of poverty in one stroke of the pen. We will pull millions of people out of poverty and circulate more money in our communities and help smaller businesses do well and grow. And when you see our communities in despair, we invest in jail and prison, and King said riot control. But that same money can be invested in infrastructure and jobs, schools and public health. We have to not fight democratic reform, but consistently push it past its limits. We cannot fight democratic reform. We have to push it past its limits. Our fight as a people has always been a democratic one that pushed America to that limit. That fight is unfinished.
Thank you.
And we are inextricably tied to that history, and no matter how much they want to hide it, they can't deny it. And no matter how revolutionary you think you are, you can't escape it. America's destiny is tied to your struggle. We are American history. There is no history in America without us.
Amen to that.
Our story is connected to the struggle against slavery and human bondage, to the fight for an 8-hour day. Our blood paints the history of this country, and our fingerprints rest permanently on its future. We have pushed and pushed and pushed and have run up a seemingly brick wall. Our children are in the streets all over the country, standing up for their humanity, speaking loudly, but are disconnected from a deeper and broader struggle. And instead of criticizing them, we have to get to work.
Thank you.
We have created a class of professionals, a class that has had greater access to education than any other generation of us, like the first introduction that we had to public school during Reconstruction. They have had access to greater volumes of information and have moved higher in it. And though the gap is widening, our children, because James Merritt was shot in the back, because people stood up, have unprecedented access to education. But they believe that this access was given to them on their own merits.
Yep. Tell me.
They don't believe in protest or marching or meetings or raucousness.
Nope.
Some don't even have the time to vote. They don't know that there was a time people wouldn't even read their resume, never mind give them credit for it. They have become technocrats and bureaucrats. They have become specialists and some superstars with access to huge and obscene amounts of wealth that have turned a blind eye to history and have ignored the present, have sided with the privilege at the expense of their own great-grandmothers. This is our fault. So in politics, many of my colleagues believe the cause serves their seat and not that their seat serves the cause. You have actors and singers and athletes not like John Carlos or Muhammad Ali or even Roberto Clemente or Nina Simone or Miri Baraka or Curtis Mayfield, James Baldwin or Harry Belafonte, but those that have drowned themselves in the nihilism of popular culture and the self-depreciating idea of I did this all by myself. You have wealthy black Americans that have barricaded themselves behind the wall of indifference. They serve as a barrier to democracy. They serve as a barrier to democracy. But I am optimistic. Even in a field of despair, I am optimistic. I have to be optimistic. During the Newark Rebellion in 1967, my father was handcuffed to a wheelchair in a local hospital. My mother running around the city trying to find him. He was hit across the head by a police nightstick from a classmate of his from Barringer High School. Wow. He went to shake his hand. He was met with a billy club over his head. His struggles were not in vain. As July 1st in 2014, just 6 months after he left us, his son was inaugurated the 40th mayor of the state's largest city. I am optimistic. There's something afoot here. As we watch our children all over the country using social media to organize and unite themselves. Rosa Parks didn't have Instagram. King couldn't invite people to the Edmund Pettus Bridge on Twitter. Our kids are using the very thing that has been used against them to continue to push for their humanity and democracy. I am optimistic.
Thank you.
I'm optimistic because we are learning that democracy is not just about stopping police from beating us, but to provide adequate protection to every citizen under the law, present-day anti-lynching bill, and civilian oversight. I am optimistic because we are learning that democracy is not just about having the right to vote, but to have power in our communities and over our lives directly, the right to govern ourselves and protect ourselves. I am optimistic because we are learning that democracy is not just about access to jobs, but access to living wages, that everyone has the right to work and should be working. I am optimistic because we are learning that health care should be in the hands of every person and that we should be free from curable diseases. I am optimistic because we know that democracy is not about access to good food, but for people to be free from hunger. I am optimistic because we know that democracy is just not about one group, but about all of us. And as long as one of us is suffering at the hands of tyranny, we all are. As long as one of us is trapped in a never-ending cycle of poverty and hopelessness, we all are. I am optimistic because I know that no lie can live forever. I am optimistic because I know that truth crushed the earth rises again. I am optimistic because I know nothing can get in front of the motion of history. I am optimistic because I read someday that the meek will inherit the earth. I am optimistic because I know victory belongs to the people and is at our doorsteps waiting for us to invite it in. I am optimistic because I look at young people in the city of Newark every day who defy poverty, who defy hopelessness, who defy failure every day. They walk through the streets of a poverty-ridden city, of a gang-ridden city, and say, I am a human being. I am optimistic because of these young people who performed here for us today to make it known to everybody in this city, in this state, and this country that we are human beings, that our lives matter, and that we will struggle to the end. And they didn't know Emmett Till.
Nope.
And they wasn't around in Selma. And unfortunately, we didn't give them the education that they needed to be clear about what they're doing here today.
Thank you.
But I am optimistic that somehow they understand that they are smack dab in the middle of history, and that their voice and their actions and their words will carry us another decade, another century into democracy. I am optimistic because I know even in the limiting forms of democracy that exist today, that our struggle forward will make this country freer and freer and freer. And as we make America free, we make the world free. And as we fight to make America democratic, we make the world more democratic. And as we unite the peoples of all nationalities in America, people all over the world unite by our example. And that when we stand on truth, freedom, justice, and equality, we cannot lose. I have to be optimistic. Nobody would have told a young boy standing on Avon Avenue in front of Yusef's Steak and Tape that one day he would be the mayor of the largest city in the state. That there would be a coalition of people who favored progression more than slavery, who loved freedom more than they loved party politics, who loved their lives and their city and its future more than people wanted to be involved in cronyism. I was elected the mayor of that city because the people of Newark believed in Newark and believed in themselves. God bless you.